This is Today As It Happened. Happy Martin Luther King Jr. Day. I'm Holly Furfer, here with your chronological look at the biggest events and stories of the day. From the growing tensions in Greenland as President Donald Trump aims for a U.S. takeover, to the ongoing anti-ICE protests in Minnesota. But first, let's take a look at some of our other top headlines of the day. The Justice Department is investigating protesters who disrupted church services in Minnesota, where a local ICE official apparently serves as pastor. The group interrupted services at City's Church in St. Paul by chanting "ICE out" and "Justice for Renee Good," a mother of three fatally shot by an ICE agent earlier this month. Protesters allege Pastor David Easterwood also leads the local ICE field office, overseeing operations that have involved violent tactics. And all this as the Pentagon has ordered about 1,500 active duty soldiers to prepare for possible deployment to Minnesota as immigration enforcement operations continue. State officials have also mobilized the National Guard, though a deployment is not guaranteed. The Pentagon's move follows reports of an expected surge in Customs and Border Protection agents and other federal personnel, including FBI agents. And the fallout over President Trump's desire to take power over Greenland is growing. New this morning, British Prime Minister Keir Starmer is calling President Trump's threat of tariffs against allies over Greenland completely wrong. Trump said Saturday that he would charge a 10% import tax on goods from 8 European nations, including the UK, because of their opposition to American control of Greenland. The president indicated the tariffs were retaliation for last week's deployment of troops from European countries to the Danish territory. More now on the growing tensions between President Trump and the 8 European Union allies that are being hit with tariffs for their stance on Greenland. The group of 8 reportedly weighing the use of what's called the trade bazooka. Scripps News international correspondent Will Denslow is in Brussels for us. And Will, what are EU nations planning to do in response to President Trump's tariff plan? They've been talking a lot in meetings.
That's absolutely right, Holly. Essentially, an overriding message we're hearing from European leaders, including those that will be subject to these tariffs as early as next month, is that they're calling for further dialogue. They have warned the United States in a statement released by the 8 nations that this use of potential tariffs on them would create a downward spiral, as they describe it, also would damage the transatlantic relationship. Now, while there are calls for dialogue, the European Commission just a few hours ago calling for restraint in as things develop, but there are options at the European Union and member states' disposal should they pursue it. Now, when it comes to this so-called trade bazooka, this is an anti-coercion instrument that was brought in to effect in 2023. It's never been used before here in Europe, but essentially it would give the bloc more powers in terms of economic action against another entity. So it could do things as well as imposing tariffs of its own going forward, could also do things like impose export control. So certainly there are more aggressive moves that could be made. France and Germany, for example, have suggested they'd be open to such a presence, but whether there's consensus across the bloc, well, that'll be a key topic of discussion when European leaders gather here in Brussels on Thursday for an emergency meeting.
And Will, you're standing outside NATO headquarters there in Brussels. We know that the Danish and Greenland ministers are about to meet soon. What can we expect to come from that meeting?
Holly, that's absolutely right. This is an opportunity for those leaders to meet with Mark Rutte, NATO's Secretary General, to get a better understanding of what exactly the United States wants when it comes to these security concerns. We know that Rutte spoke with US President Donald Trump over the weekend, and we know that he'll be speaking with him face to face at the Davos Economic Forum a little bit later this week. Recently, we know that European allies of Denmark and Greenland have bolstered their military presence in coordination with Denmark. That has rattled the United States and drawn the ire of US President Trump, who says that they're playing a dangerous game. Now, Europe's position is they're doing this to show that they're serious about this shared Atlantic security issue. But of course, that has had the opposite effect, it seems, from the US president, and the message is from the US that only they are strong enough to handle the security of the Arctic region. So really, this meeting here at NATO headquarters, an opportunity to see what can be done by fellow members of this military alliance to try and show the United States that they can both secure the Arctic and keep it under the control of Denmark and Europe.
All right, Will Denzler live for us in Brussels. Will, thank you for that update. And a high-speed train derailment in Spain has killed at least 39 people and injured dozens more in one of the country's worst rail disasters in more than a decade. That train was traveling from Malaga to Madrid with 371 people on board when its rear three carriages derailed and crashed into another high-speed train going in the opposite direction. The collision near Ademuz in southern Spain caused both trains to overturn at high speed. At least 73 passengers were injured, including 24 in serious condition. Passengers were seen scrambling out of windows and escaping through the roof of those overturned train cars. And a rare weather event hit Florida on Sunday as snow fell on the Sunshine State. The snow flurries dusted the Panhandle, but there was no significant accumulation. Temperatures remain cold, with the National Weather Service issuing a freeze warning that will stay in effect through this morning. Last January, the Panhandle saw a record-breaking amount of snow, with about 8 to 10 inches falling in some spots. And in the NFL playoffs, the conference finals are set after Sunday's final two divisional games. In the AFC, the Patriots continued their surprising turnaround season with an impressive home win over the Houston Texans. The play of the day came on this incredible touchdown catch by New England's Kayshon Boutte from quarterback Drake May. The New England Patriots won 28-16 and will play at Denver next Sunday for the AFC Championship. And over in the NFC, I'm just going to say it was heartbreaking. The late game providing late game heroics. The LA Rams at the Chicago Bears home. The Bears down to their final play, down by 7 seconds remaining. Quarterback Caleb Williams scrambles and throws up a prayer to the end zone, where the Bears tight end Colt Kmet pulled in the ball to tie the game at 17. It was such a catch. In overtime, the Bears looked to be driving for the winning score when Rams defender Cam Curl intercepts Williams with admittedly a great catch, setting up the game-winning field goal. LA wins in OT 20-17 and will travel to Seattle next week to take on the Seahawks in the NFC Championship game. Congrats to the Rams. Coming up on Today As It Happened.
I do believe that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. set an example of how to respond during these turbulent times.
Welcome back to Today As It Happened. Let's check back in on our daily briefing of the day's top stories. The Justice Department is vowing to press charges after a group of protesters stormed into a Minneapolis church and interrupted service. Protesters say the pastor works for ICE, and they say his operations have involved violent tactics and illegal arrests. Scripps News Washington correspondent Stephanie Liebergen joins us now live from our D.C. newsroom. All right, Steph, what potential charges do we know that these protesters might face?
So, Holly, these protesters could be facing multi-thousand-dollar fines or time in jail if convicted under this federal law that the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Office says they're looking into. So they're looking at a violation of what's called the FACE Act, and part of that act protects places like reproductive health centers, but also it protects places of worship. And so a violation of this act would be prohibiting or blocking somebody's access to a church, to a synagogue, to any kind of place of worship. So that's the federal law that the DOJ is looking into after this protest, where the protesters walked in and disrupted the services. Now, This investigation is coming at the direction of the Attorney General Pam Bondi, who posted about this protest and the subsequent investigation over the weekend. She said she spoke to a pastor at that Minnesota church that was targeted. She said attacks against law enforcement and the intimidation of Christians are being met with the full force of federal law. State leaders refuse to act responsibly to prevent lawlessness. This Department of Justice will remain mobilized to prosecute federal crimes and ensure the rule of law prevails. So convictions under this FACE Act, you're talking if it's a first offense, for example, up to $10,000 in fines, a year in jail. If it's a second offense, up to $25,000 in fines. It doesn't appear that anybody was injured in that protest at the church and in the disruption of the church services. But if someone was injured, the amount of jail time spikes up to a maximum of 10 years in prison. Holly. So certainly just one of many investigations that the Department of Justice is looking into, all surrounding this increased ICE immigration enforcement around the Twin Cities.
And Steph, we also hear that about 1,000 soldiers are on standby to travel to Minnesota if needed. What do we know about that?
So these 1,500 soldiers are based out of Alaska, and they are specifically trained to work in Arctic temperatures. You were just talking about the weather, and the cold weather is part of why these particular Army soldiers are now on standby. For example, the high today in Minnesota, 4 degrees. Lows overnight this week down to negative 15 degrees. You were looking at those wind chills that are negative 29, but it's not just those Alaska officers that are on standby. This is video of the Minnesota National Guard. They are also on standby, but that is under the order of the Minnesota Governor, Tim Walz. They have not been deployed yet. The Minnesota National Guard has not been put out on the streets in the Twin Cities, but they are mobilized and ready to go. So we already know we have about 2,000 federal law enforcement officers on the ground in the Twin Cities. And then there's now the Minnesota National Guard plus these Alaska troops. So there's thousands more that could show up on the streets in Minnesota if these protests were to get violent or more disruptive. It's unclear exactly what the line is, either for the Minnesota National Guard or for these Alaska troops, what exactly would need to happen for their standby position to become a full mobilization.
All right, Scripps News Washington correspondent Stephanie Liebergen live for us. Thank you for that update, Steph. It's been 57 years since Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated on a hotel balcony in Memphis, Tennessee. His death led to widespread mourning and unrest across the country. And ever since, his legacy has impacted economic justice, housing, and voting rights. Andre Perry is with us now to discuss Dr. King's legacy. Mr. Perry is a senior fellow at Brookings Metro. Thank you for being here. You also are an author of a new book, Black Power Scorecard. We appreciate your time this morning. And let me start by asking you, Andre, how does Dr. King's vision for a radical revolution of values, as he said, from the Poor People's Campaign compare to today's economic challenges? And what specific PPC goals do you feel are most relevant now?
Well, happy MLK Day. And in their last segment, you talked about what's happening in Minneapolis. I do believe that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. set an example of how to respond during these turbulent times. Not only did he fight for civic rights, which we certainly are more familiar with, he also fought for economic rights. The two were hand in glove. One of the quotes I just want to provide to you during this time, Dr. King stated during his Nobel Peace Prize speech, "The rich nations must use their vast resources of wealth to develop the underdeveloped, school the unschooled, and feed the unfed." And those words are certainly pertinent today. When you think about affordability, when you think about rising housing prices, when you think about how housing impacts every other aspect of life, from life expectancy to education, to overall this quality of life, Martin Luther King Jr. today would be pressing to close a housing gap that we still see since the passage of the Fair Housing Act in 1968. But MLK certainly connected economic rights to civic rights in order so that people could thrive in this country.
So what do you think are the biggest roadblocks to closing the racial wealth gap that we have today that leads to all of this?
Well, as you said, there was a wealth gap that is pretty sizable. In general, we see that Black wealth on average about 44,000 per household. It's about 62,000 for Latinos, 285,000 for whites, and 536,000 for Asian Americans. So you see that wide distribution. And when you look at what the Black wealth comprises of, most of it is in home ownership. Second is in business ownership. So we want to accentuate those two aspects. But what is certainly low compared to other groups is the amount in the stock market. So Black people are concentrated in jobs where they don't have as many 401ks. We don't have as many high-paying jobs where you can put your discretionary income into the stock market. And so Black wealth is actually increasing from the last time we measured the wealth gap. But so is the wealth gap itself, largely because of activity in the stock market. And so the biggest barrier is wealth itself. If you increase wealth, if you find new products that meets Black homeowners where their wealth profiles are, you can close that gap. But a lot of this has to do with how Black people are earning incomes, the kinds of businesses we hold, and the equity in the homes that we hold.
And we know Dr. King fought against housing discrimination in Chicago through the Chicago Freedom Movement. So what policy changes are needed to achieve true housing justice for minority communities?
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. When he was in Chicago 2 years before his death, he rallied in Chicago to show that discrimination was as prevalent in the North as it was in the South. And in the aftermath of his death in '68, President Johnson hastened the Fair Housing Act, which barred discrimination in housing. Now, while on the surface, we don't necessarily allow for discrimination, but many of the structures that were in place then are still in place now. Our appraisal practices, the single-family zoning ordinances, and other our credit scoring systems. And while these things have changed slightly, they are still pillars of the housing market and our housing system. And so until you are able to change those aspects of the housing market, you're still going to see slow growth. In addition, I mentioned this earlier, we need to find ways to get new products to low wealth individuals. A special purpose credit program, for instance, can assist. And these are programs that allow financial institutions to shift or to provide loans with different criteria. And so there are lots of things we can do. It's really about the willingness and creating a demand to create legislation. And by the way, with the back and forth with executive orders between administration, we haven't seen true legislation. And that's what we need to bring some equity to the housing market.
Andre Perry, Senior Fellow at Brookings Metro. Thank you so much for your time today as we remember the late, great Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. today. We appreciate your time. Straight ahead on Today As It Happened.
I'm John Matarese. Have an old iPad or laptop, maybe some phones you haven't used in years? I'm going to show you how you can turn those devices into cash.
Thanks for staying with us here on Today As It Happened. I'm Holly Furfer with your daily look at the day's biggest stories.
Did you get some new gadgets over the holidays? Or maybe you have a drawer full of old phones you never use anymore? Well, either way, you might be able to turn those old devices into cash.
Have an old PC, gaming system, or games you haven't played in years?
How about an old iPhone?
Bring them in, they'll make a deal with you, and then leave with cash.
Kevin Wood started the new year with some early spring cleaning.
Nintendo? Right, yeah, we got a few of those actually.
Brett Gieselbach is a regional manager at Paymore, which buys, trades, and sells used electronics.
We've bought lots of laptops, iPads. We love Apple TVs.
No having to deal with strangers, they handle it all.
If you accept our offer, we'll wipe it in front of you, make sure that your data is safe, and then after that, we'll take care of everything else.
Russell Holly is the shopping content director at CNET. His top pick for selling electronics online is the marketplace Swappa.
You as the person selling as well as the person buying have quite a bit of control with that platform. You can ask for additional pictures of the product if you're planning on making a purchase. If you're planning on listing it, you can list it for whatever price you want.
Other platforms for selling include It's Worth More, Buyback World, and Back Market. CNET also recommends trade-in programs from companies like Amazon, Best Buy, and Apple. Not everything is worth selling. Holly says monitors have decent return, but printers not so much. He says when that old tech becomes a hunk of junk, recycle it with help from a service like Earth 911.
It's one that has a search function so that you can see specifically electronics-focused recycling centers near you.
For products with life left, a local store like this one may be the quickest and easiest way to get cash.
20, 40, 60, and 80.
And that way you don't waste your money.
Have a good day.
John Mattery, Scripps News Group.
We'll be right back with more of today's top stories on Today as It Happened. Welcome back to Today as It Happened, Scripps News end-of-day snapshot of our biggest stories. So why don't we pick up right where we left off?
Bruce Springsteen slammed President Trump during a surprise performance at the Light of Day Winterfest concert. It happened Saturday night in his home state of New Jersey. Springsteen was particularly critical of immigration enforcement and the killing of Renee Good. He called on federal agents to leave Minneapolis and for fans to tell Trump the same.
If you believe you don't deserve to be murdered for exercising your American right to protest, and send a message to this president, and as the mayor of that city has said, ICE should get out of here.
The White House has responded, doubling down on its claim that Renee Good was using her vehicle as a deadly weapon and calling Springsteen's political opinions, quote, bad. In another tough weekend for Bills fans, the Bills, fresh off another gut-wrenching playoff loss on Saturday, have fired head coach Sean McDermott. McDermott had been with the Bills for the past 9 seasons and led the team to the playoffs for the last 7 straight. However, despite all that success, the Bills haven't been able to get to the Super Bowl under McDermott, even with having an MVP quarterback in Josh Allen. In 1 month, that's how long it has been since the Justice Department was supposed to release all of the Jeffrey Epstein files. And so far, only about 1% of the documents the DOJ acknowledges have been made public. According to a recent CNN survey, only 6% of Americans are satisfied with the release thus far. Scripps News national correspondent Alex Miller is live for us in New York with the latest on this. And Alex, we saw a flurry of filings last week that were all pretty contradictory. The last one suggests a federal judge in New York took no action to comply with the law.
Well, that's right, Andrew. Essentially, what the Department of Justice says is that the judge in the Ghislaine Maxwell case can't and shouldn't enforce the Epstein Files Transparency Act. What this looks like is this filing came down late Friday evening, where it was a letter that was written to Judge Engelmayer. He is the one who was the judge in Ghislaine Maxwell's trial. And up until the Epstein Files Transparency Act was passed and signed into law, he had actually denied efforts to release any grand jury material, saying that he didn't think that it was really his place to do so. Once that law was passed, the bill was passed and signed into law, he essentially said, okay, now we should release these files. And what the Department of Justice is saying is that they don't think it's his place to do so. They filed this motion asking to block the appointment of an independent monitor, which we learned last week is something that Congressman Ro Khanna and Thomas Massie, the authors of the bill, are asking for. They say, the Department of Justice says, that those two men, the congressmen, don't have standing to get involved in this case. I want to read you a little piece of this filing. It says, the act does not provide a cause of action. This court may not create the action through judicial mandate. So what that really means is that the bill does not create an action for the courts to do. And therefore, the courts cannot go further and mandate the release of these files. Now, that's exactly what the bill actually says, is that all files related to the investigation into Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell need to come out, and this judge is a federal judge, and therefore it would fall under his purview. Congressman Massie, you just saw that tweet coming up, they are criticizing the administration for putting forward this request, saying, why is this administration working harder to hide the Epstein files than prior administrations did to cover up Iran-Contra and Watergate? We have not heard from the judge yet, not only whether he plans to appoint an independent monitor on this, or whether he thinks that the congressmen have standing to even bring these kinds of complaints.
And so, Alex, what was the DOJ saying differently there than in other recent statements?
So the other letters that we saw last week went to this judge, but also to the judge in the Epstein case. And essentially, they acted like they were moving along as fast as they could. In this letter, they said they had hired an additional 80 attorneys to work on this case day in and day out, that they had 400 people already working on it across multiple divisions within the Department of Justice. Now, they didn't give a timeline for when they think they can get these files out, but they laid out and have in recent filings many different ways that they feel like they are complying with this, saying that they're doing essentially the best they can with millions of documents that they need to go through. And even Congressman James Comer said last week, who is the chairman of the House Oversight Committee, which is doing their own investigation, he said that the Department of Justice is complying, or cooperating rather. And so you have these two letters that are really just kind of contradictory to each other, where the Department of Justice is saying, we're working on this, and on the other hand, saying to the federal judge, you shouldn't be releasing the files that you have that are pertinent to this law.
Yeah, and you listen to some of the Republicans, some who even supported that discharge petition, and it just doesn't feel like the political momentum is there in the same way it was 1 month ago. Yeah. We obviously will see more when Congress returns back to Washington. Scripps News national correspondent Alex Miller for us in New York. Alex, thanks for that.
Straight ahead, on Today As It Happened, many people
The FBI reportedly started investigating the ICE agent who shot Renee Good and then reversed course. The Justice Department usually launches probes into the officer's conduct in such shootings. That's to ensure law enforcement did not breach any civil rights. Sources told CNN that the FBI opened such a probe into ICE veteran Jonathan Ross, who shot Good, but now the investigation is focused on the conduct of Good and her widow. At least 6 prosecutors at the U.S. Attorney's Office in Minnesota have resigned amid federal pressure on the case. And developers want to bring a little bit of Las Vegas to the D.C. area. Maryland officials have announced plans to build a venue like the Las Vegas Sphere at National Harbor. It would overlook the Potomac River, and this new sphere would have an exterior light display, but only have about 6,000 seats. State and local leaders say it could help replace lost entertainment revenue in the area, and state lawmakers still need to sign off on the project before it moves forward. And a major legal showdown is underway in London. Prince Harry and 6 of London's most famous celebrities, including Elton John, are suing the publishers of one of Britain's most popular newspapers, the Daily Mail. They accuse them of hiring private investigators to follow them and tap their phones. The publisher, A&L, has denied these accusations, calling the claims preposterous. Prince Harry is expected to testify on Thursday. If you are planning to spend Martin Luther King Jr. Day exploring a national park for free, that won't be in the cards today. This year, the holiday will be a little different, and it might catch some visitors by surprise. Scripps News correspondent Holly Furfer reports on a change the Trump administration has made.
If you're planning on celebrating this Martin Luther King Jr. Day exploring a national park for free, you may want to check before you go, because this year it's going to look a little bit different, and it's catching many people by surprise. In the past years, MLK Day has often been one of several days when the National Park Service waived entrance fees to encourage people to get outside and reflect on Dr. King's legacy of service. But this year, that free admission is not happening. The reason national parks are not free on Martin Luther King Jr. Day this year is because the National Park Service updated its list of fee-free days for 2026, and the Trump administration has removed MLK Day from that list.
I was a bit shocked that MLK wasn't included.
Instead, the agency has shifted to a new set of fee-free days that emphasize other observances, such as President's Day, Memorial Day, and Flag Day, which is also President Trump's birthday, leaving MLK Day and some other holidays off the calendar.
Yeah, I really think it's unfortunate, and it's about not only our outdoors, but also our natural heritage, which includes the history and celebrating historic figures.
Jason O'Neill is with the advocacy group Save Our Parks and says many visitors may be disappointed by the change.
That now means, people that may have planned are now paying more.
Parks will still be open and ready for visitors. Entrance fees help fund trail maintenance, visitor services, and conservation efforts, especially during busy holiday weekends when staffing and upkeep costs are higher.
The funding that the American people pay into the Park Service actually goes back out into the parks on the ground to support roads, signage, visitor centers, and the visitor experience.
So if you're heading out to a national park today, be sure to bring your park pass, your payment method, and maybe a little extra patience. The views are still free, even if the entrance isn't.
Martin Luther King Day is known as a day of service, and it really does honor the memory of Dr. King and his willingness to serve all the American people. And so I encourage every American to get out there and be of service. And you can do that in America's national parks.
Holly Furfer, Scripps News Group. We'll be right back to continue the rundown of today's top stories on Today as It Happened. Welcome back to Today as It Happened. I'm Holly Furfer. All right, let's jump right back into our rundown of the day's top stories.
A fallout over President Trump's desire to take over Greenland is growing. U.S. allies in Europe are banding together against Trump after he threatened a 10% tariff on them unless Denmark surrenders control of the Arctic country. Scripps News White House correspondent Haley Bull joins us now live. And Haley, what do we know about the White House plans?
Well, Andrew, the White House appears to be increasing pressure on Greenland as President Trump is doubling down that the U.S. must acquire it for national security, despite pushback from allies. President Trump now using tariffs in an effort to force the purchase of Greenland ahead of seeing many allies in Davos later this week. He says via Truth Social that he will levy a 10% tariff starting in February against Denmark, Norway, Sweden, France, Germany, the UK, the Netherlands, and Finland to go up to 25% in June until such time as a purchase. The president citing Chinese and Russian ambitions in the Arctic, the U.S. efforts to build a Golden Dome, and allies' presence in Greenland as NATO allies have expanded military exercises. The president writing on Truth Social in part, quote, "These countries who are playing this very dangerous game have put a level of risk in play that is not tenable or sustainable. Therefore, it is imperative that in order to protect global peace and security, strong measures be taken so that this potentially perilous situation end quickly and without question." Now, this marks a significant move after the U.S., Greenland, and Denmark officials had agreed to form a working group following a White House meeting last week. Now, we have seen the president use the threat of tariffs frequently in his second term, including over allies when it comes to drug prices, resetting trade deals, or effort for peace deals. But this marks his first use in an effort for the United States to acquire further territory. Now, while allies have broadly agreed on the need for security in the Arctic and cited the exercises as responding to that need without posing a threat, they have rejected the notion of U.S. acquisition and have been consulting together as well. A joint statement from a number of European nations states in part, quote, "Tariff threats undermine transatlantic relations and risk a dangerous downward spiral. We will continue to stand united and coordinated in our response. We are committed to upholding our sovereignty." Now, EU's leader says it would undermine transatlantic relations. French President Emmanuel Macron says they will respond in a, quote, "united and coordinated manner" if the tariffs are confirmed. While UK Prime Minister Kier Starmer appeared to take a measured approach, citing the need for discussion and dismissing the notion that President Trump is serious about military action, saying this.
And so any decision about the future status of Greenland belongs to the people of Greenland and the Kingdom of Denmark alone. That right is fundamental, and we support it. Alliances endure because they're built on respect and partnership, not pressure. That is why I said the use of tariffs against allies is completely wrong.
Meanwhile, Andrew, Norway's prime minister confirmed he received a text message from President Trump that reportedly said that he no longer felt obligated to, quote, think purely of peace after he did not win the Nobel Peace Prize. The prime minister said it was received after outreach to President Trump about opposition to the tariffs and underscoring a need to de-escalate. Of course, that award is given by a committee, not the Norwegian government. Meanwhile, NATO Secretary General says he spoke with President Trump over the weekend ahead of a meeting today with Greenlandic and Danish officials. Of course, many of these leaders set to be in the same spot this week for Davos, which we will be closely following, Andrew.
All right, Scripps News, White House correspondent Haley Bull live for us in our D.C. newsroom. Haley, thank you. For more on the economic impact of this potential scuffle, we turn now to Maura Barrett. Again, the 10% tariffs on imports from 8 NATO allies all over this refusal to cede Greenland, essentially. It could have larger implications on American consumers. Maura Barrett, our business and tech correspondent, joins me now. So, Maura, we know that these tariffs ultimately function like a tax on imported goods. How will these additional tariffs potentially impact Americans?
Well, Andrew, as we've seen over the last year, ultimately tariffs can cause a lot of foreign policy tension, issues with trade partners, and as we've seen as well, pass on a lot of those costs to American consumers. We actually just got new numbers, a new study out today from a German think tank, the Kiel Institute, that straight up quoted the 2025 U.S. tariffs are a, quote, own goal. Ultimately, American importers and consumers bear almost the entire cost. They found that looking at shipping valuations of up to $4 trillion, that American consumers were being passed on about 96% of that cost, foreign producers only taking on 4% of that cost, and that's just from the tariffs that have been in place and were analyzed through the 2025 year. And so going into additional tariffs being placed come February, as Haley laid out, potentially being increased come June, could just add to that. We have seen also numbers citing the fact that the tariffs have increased U.S. consumer prices about 5 to 6.6% and contributed a lot to those inflation metrics that we've been tracking. We heard repeatedly that tariffs were cited by Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell in their decision to hold on cutting rates for a few meetings in 2025, citing tariffs specifically as inflationary. And when you take into consideration the 8 countries that are going to be facing these 8 allies that are going to be facing these tariffs in consideration of what kind of products the U.S. gets. Just for context, Denmark, we rely on for some pharmaceutical products as well as industrial equipment and healthcare and tech devices. Norway, similarly, industrial supplies that go towards oil production and petroleum products, along with the classic seafood like salmon that we all love. And then France, aircraft, aerospace parts, as well as those luxury goods like wine, fine cheese, etc. And so this just adds to the potential price hikes that Americans are going to see, whether it's passed on in the supply chain or directly at the store for Americans. I think it's also important to know, as we're discussing all of this, that we're waiting on a Supreme Court ruling any day now. We're expected to get some opinions tomorrow in which the tariff case could be released on whether President Trump's use of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, in which he levied a bulk of those tariffs last year, and in which these Greenland retaliatory tariffs fall under as well, could be something that we see a ruling on as soon as tomorrow or in coming weeks from the Supreme Court, which would then impact how all of these are implemented, Andrew.
Yeah, that could upend so much of what we've been talking about for the past year since those so-called reciprocal tariffs went into effect. Scripps News business and tech correspondent Maura Barrett for us. Maura, thank you. Well, President Trump launching what he calls the Great Healthcare Plan. It comes as more families across the country are forced to make tough decisions about insurance coverage as premiums continue to increase. The president says his plan will restore health care in rural America and make it more affordable. Scripps News Group's Amanda Roberts in Nashville asks the experts whether that's true.
There are few things both sides of the aisle can agree on.
So we have rural health care.
But the rising cost of health care is one of them.
I think rural healthcare in Tennessee is at a very interesting point.
Unfortunately, I don't see a lot in this plan fixing a lot of the problems that we have in our healthcare system.
Enter the Great Healthcare Plan. Trump teased it in the federal spending plan, now revealing a little more about how it could help rural America. The president claims it will cut prescription drug costs, lower insurance premiums, and direct federal health care funds to people rather than insurance companies.
It could help more rural hospitals open.
Kyle Kopech with Brighton Health is working to reopen those hospitals, like we saw at Perry County Community Hospital. He says this approach to eliminate more of the insurance company middleman will help make rural Tennessee communities healthier.
The money's now going to go to the patients. And it allows the hospitals to come to the table and the insurance companies to come to the table and say, how are we going to best serve those patients now that the dollars are going to them?
Folks don't usually have a choice when they're having an emergency. They go to the closest hospital where they can receive care.
Emergency physician Dr. Katrina Green says those in rural areas cannot shop around in an emergency. She says the best way to prevent an emergency is regular health care and fears the average consumer won't spend more on health care given extra subsidies.
And now health insurance costs going up. Someone's going to have to make some tough choices. They wait until they're very, very sick to come see me and my colleagues in the emergency department.
So there's hope, but cautious optimism for an affordable health plan, no matter what part of the country you call home. Reporting in Nashville, I'm Amanda Roberts.
Thanks so much for spending some of your evening with Today As It Happened. I'm Holly Furfer. Have an excellent Monday night.